The White House confirmed today that the United States warned Qatar ahead of Israeli airstrikes, an acknowledgement that underscores Washington's role in a tense and rapidly evolving crisis in the Middle East. The disclosure marks a rare glimpse into the quiet diplomacy that often unfolds behind the scenes when allies and partners are drawn into the orbit of conflict. It is a detail that may seem procedural on the surface, but in fact it reveals much about how the Biden administration is navigating the balance between supporting Israel, maintaining communication with Arab partners, and preventing wider escalation across the region. The announcement came during a White House briefing where officials stressed that the United States was working closely with regional actors to ensure that key partners were not blindsided by developments that could affect both political stability and humanitarian outcomes. Qatar, in particular, holds a unique position. For years, it has served as a mediator between Israel and Hamas, as well as between Washington and groups that the United States does not engage with directly. That role has made Doha an indispensable player in negotiations involving hostages, ceasefires, and humanitarian access. By warning Qatar in advance of Israeli military action, the United States signaled that it wanted to avoid a rupture in communication at a delicate time. Officials framed the move as part of ongoing coordination, language that conveys continuity rather than a sudden shift. But behind the diplomatic phrasing lies a recognition. Without careful consultation, Qatar's mediating role could be undermined, and with it, some of the few available channels for negotiation. The timing of the disclosure is significant. Israeli strikes have intensified in recent days, with targets across Gaza hit by a campaign the Israeli military describes as necessary to dismantle militant infrastructure. The strikes have drawn widespread condemnation from international organizations and human rights groups who warn of deepening humanitarian catastrophe. Against that backdrop, the United States faces a difficult calculus. It is Israel's staunchest ally, providing political, military, and financial support. Yet it also understands that unchecked escalation risks igniting broader conflict, drawing in Lebanon, Syria, and potentially Iran. Warning Qatar before the strikes appears to be one measure aimed at limiting such risks. For Qatar, the warning may have carried several implications. It allowed the Gulf state to prepare diplomatically, perhaps to signal to Hamas or other factions that Israeli action was imminent, or at the very least, to avoid being caught unawares. It also reinforced the perception that Doha is a trusted interlocutor, one of the few capitals that can hold conversations on both sides of the divide. The United States, by ensuring Qatar was informed, bolstered that perception rather than undermining it. Observers note that this disclosure is unusual in its transparency. Often such warnings are kept confidential, part of the shadow diplomacy that rarely reaches the public domain. By publicly acknowledging that a warning had been delivered, the White House may be sending a message not only to regional partners, but also to domestic and international audiences. The message is one of responsibility, of foresight, of an administration keen to portray itself as managing the crisis with prudence. Yet critics will ask whether advance warning changes the realities on the ground. The strikes themselves continue, with civilian casualties mounting. Humanitarian groups argue that coordination at the diplomatic level does little to alleviate suffering, and that the United States should use its influence to press for restraint, rather than simply ensuring allies are notified. In this sense, the disclosure opens the administration to scrutiny. Is the United States merely managing the optics of war, or is it actively working to prevent further loss of life? The historical context is important here. The U.S. has long relied on Qatar as a strategic partner, not just in mediation, but also in defense. The Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar hosts thousands of U.S. personnel and plays a central role in American military operations across the region. This close relationship has given Doha leverage and responsibility in equal measure. When crises erupt, Washington turns to Qatar both as a host and as a messenger. The warning before Israeli strikes is the latest example of that dynamic in action. For Israel, the U.S. disclosure carries its own message. It reaffirms that Washington is mindful of the regional implications of Israeli operations and that even while it supports Israel's right to defend itself, it must keep Arab partners informed. This is not just about diplomacy, it is also about preventing miscalculation. In a region where alliances and rivalries crisscross in complex ways, a lack of communication can quickly spiral into misunderstanding and escalation. The disclosure also fits into a broader U.S. strategy of transparency with allies at a time of uncertainty. By making clear that it communicates with all sides, Washington positions itself as both a supporter of Israel and a manager of regional stability. It is a difficult balancing act, one that requires constant calibration. The Biden administration is acutely aware of the risks. With tensions already high, a single misstep could reverberate far beyond Gaza. International reaction to the news has been cautious. European leaders have welcomed signs of coordination, but continued to express concern about the humanitarian toll of the conflict. Regional capitals, meanwhile, are watching closely. For some, the U.S. warning to Qatar may be seen as evidence of favoritism towards Doha, a country whose independent foreign policy often sets it apart from its Gulf neighbors. For others, it reinforces the view that Qatar's unique access to groups like Hamas makes it indispensable, and that its ties to Washington provide a bridge that cannot easily be replicated. In Washington itself, the disclosure has drawn a mixed response. Supporters of the administration argue that the move demonstrates careful statesmanship at a volatile time. Critics, particularly those who favor a tougher stance on Hamas and its backers, worry that involving Qatar too closely risks giving legitimacy to actors they see as destabilizing. The debate reflects a broader divide in U.S. foreign policy circles over how best to manage the Middle East, through engagement and mediation or through pressure and isolation. As the strikes continue, the disclosure raises questions about what comes next. Will the United States continue to provide advance warnings to Qatar or other regional partners? How will these communications shape the course of negotiations, particularly around humanitarian aid and potential ceasefires? And crucially, how will Israel interpret Washington's insistence on coordination? As supportive or as a subtle check on its actions? The answers to these questions are not yet clear. What is evident is that the Biden administration wants to project an image of control in an environment where events can often seem uncontrollable. By publicly revealing its advance warning to Qatar, the White House is signaling that it is not merely reacting to the conflict, but actively managing the diplomatic currents around it. This disclosure, then, is more than a procedural footnote. It is a window into the careful, calculated diplomacy that underpins U.S. engagement in the Middle East. It is a reminder that even as bombs fall and rhetoric escalates, the machinery of coordination continues to turn, often quietly, often invisibly, but with consequences that shape the course of conflict and the prospects for peace. And it is above all a reminder of the stakes. For those in Gaza, the strikes mean destruction and fear. For Israel, they represent security and retaliation. For Qatar, they present both a challenge and an opportunity to continue mediating, to maintain credibility, and to use its unique position to keep channels of communication open. For the United States, they are yet another test of leadership in a region where every move is scrutinized, every disclosure carries weight, and every decision reverberates far beyond the immediate moment. The White House warning to Qatar may not change the trajectory of the conflict overnight, but it tells us much about how the United States sees its role, about the value it places on regional partners, and about the delicate balance it seeks to maintain between support and restraint, between solidarity and strategy, between the demands of war and the pursuit of diplomacy.
In moments of conflict, diplomacy does not stop. It shifts, it adapts, and at times it moves into the shadows. The United States' decision to warn Qatar ahead of Israeli strikes has been described by officials as part of ongoing coordination with regional partners. This phrase, ongoing coordination, may seem routine, but in the context of the Middle East today, it carries heavy meaning. It reveals how the machinery of diplomacy continues to grind, even as warplanes take off and missiles fall. It also highlights Washington's central role as both Israel's strongest ally and a mediator among Arab states whose trust is essential for any long-term stability. Diplomatic coordination in this context refers to more than simply giving advance notice. It represents a framework of communication that stretches across capitals, from Washington to Doha, from Doha to Cairo, from Tel Aviv to Amman. At its heart lies the principle that information, shared at the right moment, can prevent misunderstandings and miscalculations that could otherwise escalate into wider conflict. The warning to Qatar is only one piece of this complex puzzle, but it illustrates the United States' determination to keep its partners informed and engaged. Qatar, with its established role as an intermediary between Israel and Hamas, is a linchpin in this process. Without Doha's involvement, channels of communication with Hamas would be limited, and potential agreements on issues such as hostage release or humanitarian access would become harder to reach. By ensuring Qatar was warned in advance, Washington kept those channels intact. In diplomacy, trust is currency, and coordination is the means by which that currency is preserved. The White House, by emphasizing that this was part of ongoing coordination, sought to underline continuity, predictability, and reliability at a time when events on the ground are anything but stable. The notion of diplomatic coordination is not new. Throughout modern history, the United States has engaged in similar efforts during conflicts involving its allies. From the Gulf War to the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, Washington has worked closely with regional partners to manage crises and prevent diplomatic rifts. What makes the current moment different is the scale of mistrust and the fragile state of regional politics. Across the Middle East, countries are divided not only in their view of Israel, but also in their approach to groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Against this backdrop, coordination is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Officials in Washington understand that coordination helps shape perception as much as it prevents escalation. By informing Qatar, the United States signals respect for its role, reinforcing Doha's status as a vital diplomatic actor. At the same time, the message to Israel is that Washington's support does not come at the expense of broader regional stability. Coordination becomes both a tool of reassurance and a subtle mechanism of control. Israel is reminded that its actions, while supported, are also embedded in a larger web of alliances and partnerships that the United States must maintain. The practical dimensions of coordination extend beyond briefings and warnings. They include military-to-military communication, intelligence sharing, and back-channel diplomacy. When the White House says it warned Qatar, it is also acknowledging the invisible architecture of contact that allows information to flow quickly and discreetly. This architecture is vital in a region where events can spiral within hours. A strike in Gaza can provoke rocket fire from Lebanon, which in turn can trigger Israeli retaliation, which then risks drawing in Syria or even Iran. Coordination seeks to prevent that chain reaction from reaching a point of no return. Diplomatic coordination also serves humanitarian goals. In conflicts where civilian suffering is immense, coordination can help secure safe passages, aid convoys, and ceasefire windows. Qatar has often played this role, negotiating temporary truces or facilitating the transfer of aid. But such efforts are only possible if Doha is fully informed of the dynamics on the ground. A surprise strike could derail sensitive negotiations, undermine Qatar's credibility, and close one of the few channels through which humanitarian relief is negotiated. Thus, coordination is not just about managing war, it is about preserving the possibility of relief. Critics argue that coordination, while valuable, can sometimes become a substitute for tougher measures. By focusing on communication rather than accountability, the United States risks being seen as managing optics rather than addressing root causes. For those who demand a stronger stance on civilian protection, coordination alone is insufficient. Yet defenders of the practice counter that without coordination, even the most basic humanitarian agreements would collapse. They argue that communication, however limited, is the first step towards more substantive progress. The regional dimension of coordination is equally significant. Beyond Qatar, the United States is in constant contact with Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and other partners. Each of these countries has its own stakes in the conflict, its own red lines, and its own domestic pressures. Coordination requires balancing these competing interests, ensuring that no partner feels excluded or blindsided. In the Middle East, where perception often shapes reality, being left out of the loop can be as damaging as direct confrontation. The White House's public emphasis on coordination is therefore also a message to the wider region. Washington is listening, and it is keeping its partners informed. The diplomatic coordination also has an international dimension. The United States is not only communicating with Middle Eastern allies, but also with European partners, the United Nations, and other stakeholders. In moments of crisis, coordination helps unify messaging, preventing a fragmented response that could weaken collective efforts. When Washington discloses that it warned Qatar, it is implicitly telling the world that it takes consultation seriously. This matters in a global environment where U.S. credibility is often questioned and where allies look for signs of reliability. From a strategic perspective, coordination can also serve as leverage. By controlling the flow of information, Washington can influence behavior. A partner that knows it will be informed may be more willing to support U.S. positions. Conversely, withholding information can be a signal of disapproval. In this sense, coordination becomes not only a tool of diplomacy, but also a form of power projection. It allows the United States to shape the environment without direct confrontation. The White House's framing of the warning to Qatar as part of ongoing coordination is deliberate. It seeks to normalize the act, to present it as part of an established process rather than an extraordinary intervention. Yet the very need to make this disclosure suggests the importance the administration places on signaling coordination publicly. At a time when trust is fragile, highlighting communication becomes a way of reassuring both allies and critics. Looking ahead, the question is whether coordination will be enough to prevent escalation. With Israeli strikes continuing and the humanitarian situation worsening, pressure is mounting for more than just communication. Diplomacy must eventually deliver outcomes: ceasefires, aid access, negotiations. Coordination provides the foundation for such efforts, but it cannot replace them. The Biden administration faces the challenge of translating coordination into tangible results, of showing that communication leads not just to awareness, but to action. Yet, history shows that coordination can create openings. During past conflicts, coordination between the United States and regional partners has laid the groundwork for negotiations that later produce ceasefires or political agreements. The process is slow, often frustrating, but without coordination, those breakthroughs would not have been possible. In this sense, the warning to Qatar is a small but significant step in a longer chain of diplomatic engagement. For now, the disclosure serves as a reminder that diplomacy continues even in the darkest moments of conflict. It underscores that behind every military strike, there is a web of communication designed to manage consequences. It highlights the role of partners like Qatar, whose unique position makes coordination not just useful, but indispensable. And it reveals the United States' determination to remain at the center of that web, balancing support for Israel with the need to maintain trust among Arab allies. Diplomatic coordination may not make headlines in the same way as airstrikes or protests, but it is the quiet force that shapes the trajectory of conflict. It is the mechanism that keeps dialogue alive, the glue that holds fragile alliances together, and the tool that prevents wars from expanding beyond their immediate battlefield. In revealing its warning to Qatar, the White House has lifted the curtain on this process, offering a rare glimpse into the unseen work of diplomacy. Ultimately, the story of coordination is the story of restraint, of measured communication in a time of chaos. It is the recognition that wars are not fought only with weapons, but also with words, with phone calls, with briefings delivered behind closed doors. It is a reminder that in international politics, what is said and when it is said can shape outcomes as powerfully as what is done. The Biden administration's disclosure is therefore more than a procedural note. It is a declaration that even in war, diplomacy persists, and that coordination remains a vital tool in the pursuit of stability.